Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Maybe Midrash. This is an event that I'm doing with Felicia at Little Prairie Library and Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, where we talk about the reflections, the many, many reflections of religion in literature, for and against, Christian and non-Christian, all kinds of religion, all kinds of fiction and non-fiction. Just it's an infinitude. We could do a Maybe Midrash every month. We would barely scratch the surface in 100 years of videos. It's a thing that humans have been writing about as long as religion has existed. And I decided for my Maybe Midrash to split the month of two quick read-alongs. The first 2 weeks would be fiction, and we did God Knows by Joseph Heller, which is the story of King David, and I just love it. As a novel, I just love it. And for the second two weekends, these next 2 weekends, we're going to do a work of nonfiction, The Day the Revolution Began, by N.T. Wright. Who's written a whole slew of books, including some absolutely monstrous doorstoppers, and who he's a very eloquent writer and a heck of a guy. And this is a book about the beginnings of Christianity, and we're reading the first two sections of it. It conveniently has 4 sections, so we're reading the first 2 sections of it this weekend. I don't know how many of you have gone to the trouble of getting this or had it already. I don't know how many of you know this author, or maybe like him. I had a while getting used to his style and his particular line of thought, especially on Pauline theology, which I'm not quite sure that both ends of his Pauline theology touch the ground, if you know what I mean. So I'm still having a little bit of trouble. There are times when I think that he is just so enraptured by the stuff that he has read that what you get on the page is the rapture rather than the stuff. And so I don't know what to do about a lot of that. And in this book, the first 2 halves talk about the nature of sin, the nature of redemption. But in order to talk about that, they also talk about the nature of the ministry of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. The first section deals in elaborate length on what crucifixion meant in Jesus' world. Mentions that Jesus' crucifixion took place in between 2 famous historical crucifixions, mass crucifixions of Judah Maccabee and also the rebels of the Spartacus Revolution, all of whom were massive crucifixions for miles and miles of roadside. And N.T. Wright also goes into, I think, necessary detail about how horrible a fate crucifixion was, how long it took to die, how grotesque it was to go through, and what a social disgrace it was. Really, really, he quotes a passage from Cicero that this is something that civilized people shouldn't even mention. It's the worst possible thing. In the first sections that we're dealing with here, N.T. Wright does what many religious apologists will do, which is to say, he doesn't ever actually explicitly say it in this way, but many Christian apologists will look at that social disgrace of crucifixion and say, or imply, see, this is yet another element of why this is true, because it's so counterintuitive. Why would the earliest Christians, the Jews who were the earliest Christians, why would they have given this fate to their Messiah if it didn't really happen? And there's a lot of that in the first 2 sections of this book. Tom Wright will often just refer to that dark Friday afternoon, or the events of that dark Friday afternoon, as if it's a little bit sloppy on the part of someone who reads the ancient languages and who can do good actual biblical history. It's a little bit sloppy on the part of such a person to talk about such things when that is all folklore. That is all folklore. There are no dates here. There are no days or times of the afternoon. Good Lord, there's nothing like that kind of historical attestation. You have to get rid of all of that, or talk about it like Raymond Brown does, as though it were a coherent folklore that you happen to believe, rather than that you're referencing actual facts. You can't talk about that dark Friday afternoon when Jesus was hanging on a cross as if you were talking about that day that Julius Caesar was knifed to death. Those are radically different things, radically different. Not least which because the documents that talk about the former are religious documents. They are meant to promulgate a religion. They aren't in any way even scrupling at historical objectivity. You can't. If you do that, if you start to do that sort of thing, you start to walk down a path of factually proving this religion. And as I've mentioned in religious digressions on this channel before, you must not do that. You must not do that. It's well and good for Jesus to say to doubting Thomas, who wants to put his fingers into Jesus' wounds after he's risen from the dead. It's well and good for Jesus to say to Thomas, you believe because you see. Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. Because Jesus was in the room with Thomas when he said that. But the surest way to get the adherent of another religion, or in my case, an atheist, the surest way to get them to ignore you or argue with you is to say that this thing can be proven factually. And because it can't be. It's a matter of faith. That's why it's a religion. So I don't want to hear about Noah's Ark being real or washing up on a mountain in Turkey. I don't want to hear about that Friday afternoon. History does not touch these things. And even if it did touch these things, it would only touch the parts of it that if you have an itinerant Galilean preacher who starts to call himself God and gets condemned by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin, for that fact, well, the Sanhedrin didn't have the authority to put someone to death legally. That was Roman authority, and the Romans would just say, well, if this person is scum of the earth, crucify him. And that would be that. That could easily have happened, but to say anything else, even that you can't say that actually happened. But to say anything else the way N.T. Wright does in these first two sections, to so easily conflate what is mytho-history and what would be actual fact. His descriptions of what crucifixion is like are actually historically right and worth remembering. So that part of it bothers me a little when he sort of blends in historic seeming references to events that have no existence in history. History doesn't touch them one way or another, either to prove or to disprove. But his main purpose in these first two sections is to go well beyond that, and this author is terrific at doing that, at going well beyond, at reading into religion. It's why I know some biblical scholars, one in particular, who has nothing but scorn for this figure, for this writer, because he does that, because he reads in. But this is a former bishop, for Pete's sake. It's his job to read in the theology and theological interpretation into the historical record. It's allowable. Plenty of people have done it before him. It is a type of religious writing in this denomination and any other denomination, and he's really good at it. He's really good at getting at the essence of what the crucifixion actually meant. What was its significance? He has a part. This will give you an idea of what he's thinking on the subject, and it will also give you an idea of what he writes like, in case you didn't buy the book to do this read along, but you're curious whether you might like this author. He's talking about a typical line of thought when it comes to interpreting the crucifixion and Christianity after that. And he says the line of thought goes like this, usually based on a particular arrangement of biblical text. A, all humans sinned, causing God to be angry and to want to kill them, to burn them forever in, quote, hell. B, Jesus somehow got in the way and took the punishment instead. It helped, it seems, that he was innocent, and that he was God's own son. C, we are in the clear after all, heading for heaven instead, provided, of course, we believe it. Now he's reducing that. He's doing a little bit of straw manning. He's reducing that just a little bit so that he can tear it apart. Many preachers and teachers put it much more subtly than this, but this is still the story people hear. This is the story they expect to hear. In some churches, if you don't tell this story more or less in this way, people will say that you aren't, quote, preaching the gospel. The natural reaction to this from many who have grown up hearing this message and feeling they had to believe it if they didn't want to go to hell is that its picture of God is abhorrent. This God, such people instinctively feel, is a bloodthirsty tyrant. If there is a God, we must hope and pray that he or she or it isn't like that at all. So they react in one of... I can hear his voice while I'm reading this. I can hear his intonations while I'm doing it. So they react in one of a number of predictable ways. Some people reject the whole thing as a horrible nonsense. Others, puzzled, go back to their Bibles and to the great teachers of the early church, and they find all sorts of other things being said about the cross, for instance, that it was a means by which God's rescuing love won the ultimate victory over all the forces of darkness. Or they find early writers urging Christians to imitate the self-giving love of Jesus, and they seize upon that as, quote, the answer. The cross, they say, wasn't about God punishing sin. It was about Jesus giving us the ultimate example of love. Thus, many different interpretations have arisen, affecting the ways in which people have been taught the Bible and Christian faith. This has been a recipe for confusion. And he goes on to give his own interpretation, of that, which is that this is not. He has no patience with the interpretation of these events, of that Jesus sacrificed. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. That Jesus sacrifices his life as a bargain for many, and that after that the path is clear for us to be saved and to go to heaven. N.T. Wright has very little patience for that. As far as his interpretation goes, this was the beginning of an earthly change, an earthly revolution. And he's very eloquent about that. And that's going to be the second half. That he starts to stress that in great detail in the second half. That's what we're going to do next week. We're going to read part 3 and 4 of The Day the Revolution Began. That's my nonfiction contribution to maybe Midrash. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. We'll adjourn until next Sunday, and I'll see you then. Thank you, Book 2.